Wesley Snipes, an action icon, a man who reshaped the way Hollywood viewed the power, discipline, and presence of a black star on the big screen. From the cold ruthlessness of Blade to the powerful roles throughout many decades, he conquered the film industry with his steel physique, warrior spirit, and a will that never accepted being controlled. Millions of people saw him as the embodiment of absolute strength, of a man who could master his own destiny through discipline and unrelenting focus. But behind that image was not an easy or perfect story, but a journey full of bumps where personal choices, invisible pressures, and mistakes accumulated over time had quietly shaped an outcome no one wanted to see. Childhood growing up in the harsh environment of New York City, where survival sometimes mattered more than dreams. The years of struggling to be recognized in an industry that did not easily open its doors. Relationships gradually became distant as power and ego grew. And then, the collapse that the whole world witnessed when the man who once stood at the peak had to face the court, a prison sentence, and the cold silence of an industry that once celebrated him. 3 years behind those closed walls not only took away his freedom, but also blurred the image of a legend who was once irreplaceable. And when he stepped out, the world had moved on without waiting. No more welcoming lights, no more invitations like before. Only a man standing in the emptiness of the very legacy he once built. And now, at the age of 63, when time is no longer infinite and what has passed cannot be changed, what really happened to Wesley Snipes in the shadow of fame, in the silence of the years of being forgotten, and in the memories that never truly left, memories that perhaps even he could not escape, even though he once believed he could control everything. Before continuing, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to accompany the journey of a man who once lost everything but still did not disappear. That is a small support for a person who still moves forward in silence, when the lights have gone out and the world no longer looks toward him. After all the lights have gone out and the questions still hang suspended in the silent space, Wesley Snipes' story does not begin with glory, but begins in a place where dreams are rarely nurtured, a place where survival matters more than any aspiration. The Bronx, New York City, in the years when the streets were not just a place to walk, but a daily challenge, where children learned to grow up before they even understood what childhood was, where the sound of car horns, screams, and uneasy silences blended together into a sound that never truly stopped. And in that space, Wesley did not grow up as a boy who was protected, but as someone who had to learn to observe, had to learn to read the eyes of others before they could act, had to learn to keep his distance before being pulled into things he could not control, because in the Bronx back then, just one wrong step, one wrong decision, could change an entire life, and no one there truly believed that the outside world would come to save them. There was no clear sense of safety in those early years, no place where Wesley could completely let go, because even in the most familiar alleys, there was always something unpredictable, a look that lasted too long, a voice that was too loud, a movement that was too fast, all of which could be a sign of danger. And when you grow up in an environment like that, you are not allowed to be naive. You are not allowed to trust easily. You learn to stay silent, learn to listen more than speak, learn to step back one step to see more clearly what is happening, and gradually that vigilance is no longer a choice. It becomes instinct, becomes a part of who you are, deeply embedded in every thought, every reflex, every way you perceive the world around you. Wesley was not the only one who grew up in that situation. But what made his story different was the way he responded to it, not with resignation, but with a controlled withdrawal, a way of existing in which he did not allow himself to depend on anyone, did not allow himself to believe that others would always be there when needed, because what he saw around him was not stability, but constant change. People who came and went, relationships that formed and then vanished, and sometimes even those he thought were the closest could disappear after just one night, swept into paths that not everyone could return from. There were fears that were never named, never spoken, but present in every moment, the fear of being pulled into a conflict that did not belong to him, the fear of being misunderstood, being pushed into a corner with no way out, the fear that if you were not strong enough, if you were not alert enough, you would be swallowed by the very place you called home. And it was those fears that shaped the way Wesley saw the world, not as a place full of opportunities, but as a place that always needed to be guarded against, a place where you had to prepare for the worst, even when everything seemed to be okay. And in that process, something else also gradually formed, an invisible distance between him and those around him, not because he did not want to connect, but because he did not know how to do it without making himself vulnerable, because when you are used to protecting yourself, opening up becomes something unfamiliar, even dangerous, and over time, that distance grew larger, not only with strangers, but sometimes even with those closest to you, creating a sense of loneliness that not everyone could see from the outside. You can look at his later journey, at the nearly absolute discipline, at the way he controlled every movement, every role, every decision, and see that as strength. But deep down, it was also the trace of a child who had learned that if you do not control, if you do not hold everything tightly in your hands, the world would do it for you. And when the world controls you, it is rarely gentle. It does not ask for your opinion. It does not give you a chance to prepare. It just comes and takes away what you could not protect in time. So, from a very early age, Wesley Snipes learned a lesson that many people take a lifetime to understand: that not everyone can be trusted, that not every smile carries good intentions, that sometimes the only way to survive is to stand alone, to keep yourself safe, and to keep moving forward, even when you are not sure where the path ahead will lead. And it was that lesson, which seemed to help him survive, that quietly laid the foundation for later choices. Choices that many years later, the whole world would see the consequences of. But few truly understood that it all began much earlier, from the cold streets of the Bronx, where a child was not taught how to trust, but was taught how to survive. Not every wound comes from loud screams or clear moments of breaking. There are cracks created in silence, in meals with few words spoken, in days that pass without anyone truly asking how the other person is feeling, and in the very family space of Wesley Snipes, everything was not exactly broken. There were no dramatic scenes, no intense separations, but there was also not enough deep connection to make a child feel truly seen, truly heard, truly understood, and sometimes that very absence left marks that lasted longer than any other event, because it did not come once and end. It stretched on, quietly, repeating until it became a part of the way you exist. In the familiar rooms where they should have brought a sense of safety, there existed a nameless emptiness, where each person seemed to live in their own world, where emotions were not spoken, where thoughts were held back. And for Wesley, that gradually became normal, not because he did not need connection, but because he did not know how to find it. Because when you grow up in an environment where emotions are not shared, you learn to keep everything inside. You learn to answer your own questions, to face your fears without expecting anyone to be by your side. There were times he could look around and see that everything seemed okay. The family was still there. Life continued, but inside, a feeling of isolation still quietly grew, a feeling that even among his loved ones, he was still standing alone, not because they did not care, but because no one truly reached the deepest part of him. And when that happened long enough, you begin to believe that is how the world works, that each person must take care of themselves, that opening up is not necessary, even something to avoid. Unspoken thoughts began to accumulate, not disappearing, but sinking deeper, becoming layers of sediment of memories and emotions, and over time, they shaped the way Wesley reacted to everything around him. He did not easily share, did not easily reveal, not because he had no emotions, but because he had gotten used to keeping them inside. used to turning things that were hard to say into silence, and that very silence, at first just a reflex, gradually became a wall, a barrier between him and the world. That wall was not built in a day. It was formed through each small moment, through the times of not speaking, through the times of not being heard, through the times of choosing to hold back instead of sharing, and when it was high enough, thick enough, it not only prevented the outside world from entering, but also kept the vulnerable parts inside from escaping, creating a person who from the outside looked strong, in control, unshakable, but inside there existed gaps that had never been filled. Perhaps that is why, when stepping into adult life, Wesley carried a very personal way of seeing people and relationships. He did not trust easily, did not open up easily, and when he did place trust, he also expected certainty, control, because for him, losing control was not just a risk, but something unacceptable. And that made him different, not only in the way he worked, but in the way he existed among others. Those around him could see a strong, confident man who knew what he wanted, but few saw the rest. The part that was carefully hidden behind that shell, the part that still carried unanswered questions, emotions that had never been named, and a feeling that even though he had gone very far, had achieved so much, there was still some distance that could not be crossed. A distance that began from those early years, when silence was not just a choice, but the only language he knew to survive. And then, when the silences inside became increasingly heavy, when the invisible wall between him and the world gradually thickened over the years, Wesley Snipes began to search for something that could give him a sense of control, not control over others, but control over himself, control over his body, control over fear, control over the chaos he could not name. And that was when martial arts entered his life, not as an initial passionate choice, but as a natural reflex of someone who had gotten used to having to protect himself in a world that was not easy to predict. A way to stand firm without needing to rely on anyone, a way to exist without exposing the weaknesses he always tried to hide. The first training sessions were not about perfect technique or beautiful movements, but about learning how to keep balance when pushed down, learning how to stand up when the body ached, learning how to endure when everything became too much. And in that process, Wesley realized that martial arts did not only teach him how to fight others, but also taught him how to face himself, with his own limits, with the fears he had carried for so long, and each punch, each kick, each time falling down and standing up, became a way for him to affirm that he was not weak, that he could endure, that he could control. Discipline gradually stopped being an external requirement and became a part of his life, rhythm. Each training hour, each movement repeated until the body reacted like instinct, each drop of sweat falling like a reminder that strength does not come from luck, but from persistence. And in Wesley's world, where everything had once been so unpredictable, discipline brought something he had never had before: a sense of certainty, a structure he could hold on to, a system he could trust. Because, unlike people, discipline does not betray, does not change, does not leave him. But along with that stability, something else also gradually formed: a habit of control that was not limited to the training room, but spread to every aspect of life, from the way he worked, the way he interacted with others, to the way he made decisions. Everything had to be within control. Everything had to be calculated, because for him, losing control was not just a small mistake, but a danger, a door that could lead to the chaos he had witnessed from very early on, and therefore he did not allow that to happen, did not allow any factor to go beyond what he could grasp. Over time, that hardness became a familiar shell, not only in the body, but also in the way he expressed emotions, soft reactions, gradually replaced by controlled calm, complex emotions kept behind a cold gaze, and from the outside he became the image of a man who was not easily shaken, a man who seemed like nothing could hurt him, but inside That was not the absence of emotions, but the result of suppressing them for too long, of learning not to allow himself to reveal things that could make him vulnerable. Martial arts, in that way, was not just a skill or a professional tool. It became a core part of Wesley Snipes' being, a language he used to communicate with the world, a way to define himself, and also a shield, a layer of protection that helped him stand firm against what he could not control. But at the same time, it was also what made the distance between him and others grow larger. Because when you get used to protecting yourself too well, you also unintentionally push people away. Not because you do not need them, but because you do not know how to let them in without breaking the protection that you spent so much time building. And so, step by step, from a child who learned to survive in silence, Wesley became a man who learned to control everything through discipline, through strength, through will. But those very things, the things that once helped him stand firm, also quietly shaped the path ahead, a path where controlling everything could bring strength, but could also lead to consequences that could not always be foreseen. And then, when discipline had become an inseparable part of who he was, when his body had been trained to react with precision, and his mind had grown used to controlling everything, Wesley Snipes entered a phase where, on the outside, it seemed like he was moving closer to a clear path. But inside, there was a hard-to-define emptiness. The years of pursuing art, studying acting, coming into contact with the stage, with roles, with people carrying many different stories, all opened up before his eyes like doors, but none of those doors truly made him feel like he belonged, as if he was standing among so many choices, but did not know which one truly reflected who he was. Not because of a lack of opportunities, but because of a lack of the certainty that this was the path meant for him. In those acting classes, where people were encouraged to reveal emotions, to share the deepest parts of themselves, to create authenticity on stage, Wesley stood in a different position. He understood the technique. He had discipline. He had the ability to control his body and voice, but opening up, allowing himself to truly feel and express the things that had been suppressed for so long, was not easy at all. Because when you have grown used to keeping everything inside, bringing them out was not only a professional challenge, but also a personal risk, something that could shake what you had built to protect yourself. There were moments when he stood on stage, speaking the lines of another character, living the life of someone else, and realized that he himself was the person he understood the least, that he could step into a role perfectly, could make the audience believe in the story unfolding before their eyes. But when the lights went out, when the role ended, he returned to a familiar feeling, the feeling of not truly knowing who he was beyond what he performed, a distance between his true self and the images he created, a distance he did not know how to close. The feeling of not belonging anywhere did not only appear in work, but also seeped into the relationships around him. He could be among like-minded people, artists, people pursuing dreams just like him, but still felt like he stood on the outside, as if there was always a barrier he could not break. Not because he did not want to, but because he did not know how to exist without holding back a part of himself. And when you always hold back a part, you will never truly feel like you belong anywhere. Deep inside, a conflict began to form, between ambition and doubt, between the desire to go further and the fear that he was not enough, that everything he was doing was just a shell, that one day people would realize the uncertainty inside him. And that very conflict made each step feel heavier, not because of a lack of ability, but because every decision came with a question, a hesitation, a worry that he was going in the wrong direction without realizing it. But at the same time, something else was also growing, an intense need to prove his own worth, not only to the world, but to himself. A need to affirm that all those years of training, all the efforts, all the sacrifices had meaning, that he was not just someone trying, but someone worthy, worthy of being seen, of being recognized. of standing in the position he believed he could reach, and that need, at first just a motivation, gradually became a pressure, an inner voice that kept pushing him forward, even when he did not truly know where he was going. Wesley's sense of self began to form in this very phase, not as something clear and stable, but as a structure being built piece by piece, influenced by what he had been through, by the environment he grew up in, by the experiences in art, and by the very contradictions inside. A sense of self that wanted control, craved recognition, was strong on the outside, yet unstable on the inside. And when a person carrying such a sense of self stepped into a world like Hollywood, where everything was amplified, where success and failure both played out under the lights, the things that were not yet stable inside could easily be stretched, easily pushed to limits they themselves did not anticipate. You could look back at that period and see a person on the way to becoming a star. But if you look deeper, it was the image of a man who was still searching for himself, still trying to understand who he was beyond the roles, beyond the expectations, beyond the images others saw. And that very search had never truly ended, because it was not just the story of one phase, but part of a longer journey, a journey where every step forward carried both hope and unanswered questions, and where finding himself sometimes proved more difficult than any role he had ever played. And then, when the questions about himself still had no answers, when his sense of self was still forming slowly and full of contradictions, Wesley Snipes entered a phase where reality was no longer abstract thoughts in class or on a small stage, but real doors closing in front of him. Time after time, those audition sessions where he walked in with everything he had, the preparation, the discipline, the fragile belief that this time might be different, only to leave in silence, with the familiar rejections, the promises to call back that he gradually understood would never happen. And in that world, where hundreds of people competed for one tiny opportunity, being turned down was not unusual. But when it repeated too many times, it was no longer just an outcome. It began to become a feeling that something was not enough, not right, not seen. Hollywood at that time was not a place ready to open its doors to just anyone, especially those without a name, without a clear position. And for someone like Wesley, who carried a strong personality, a different demeanor, that was both a strength and a barrier, because not everyone knew how to see value in the unfamiliar, and therefore, he was often placed into narrow molds, small roles, opportunities that were not enough to show his full potential, as if the world was looking at him through a limited lens, not because he lacked talent, but because they were not yet ready to understand him. Financial pressure is not an unfamiliar concept in this period. It is present in every single day, in the necessary expenses, in the temporary jobs he has to take to maintain his life, in the long nights when he has to calculate how to continue pursuing his dream without letting himself fall into an uncontrollable situation. And for a person who is used to wanting to hold everything in his hands, that uncertainty is not only an external difficulty, but also an internal challenge, something that forces him to face the reality that not everything can be controlled. Not every effort brings immediate results. There are moments when the feeling of being underestimated becomes clearer than ever, not through direct words, but through the way he is perceived, through the roles he is offered, through the opportunities he does not receive. And when that happens long enough, it begins to raise uncomfortable questions, not only about the industry, but about himself, whether what he believes about himself is really true, or is it just a belief he is trying to hold on to so as not to face the possibility that he may not be enough. But what is noteworthy is not those failures, but the way he reacts to them. Because instead of stopping, instead of choosing a safer path, Wesley continues, not with absolute confidence, but with an almost stubborn persistence, a decision that he will not let rejections define who he is, that he will continue to walk into those rooms, continue to audition, continue to put himself in situations where the possibility of rejection always exists, because for him, stopping is perhaps even more frightening than failing. There are days when the fatigue comes not only from the physical, but from the very repetition of the same experiences, the auditions, the rejections, the silences that follow. And in those moments, the question of whether to continue or not becomes clearer. Not like a passing thought, but like a real choice. A path he could step onto if he wanted to end this chain of uncertain days. But each time like that, there is something that holds him back. Not the certainty that success is waiting ahead, but a deep belief that if he gives up, everything he has been through will become meaningless. Wesley's persistence in this period is not something easy to see from the outside. It does not come with big victories or honored moments. It exists in the small details, in continuing to prepare for an audition, even knowing the chance of success is very low, in maintaining personal discipline even when no one is watching, in continuing to believe in his own value even though the world has not yet recognized it, and it is precisely those things, the things no one notices, that become the foundation for what will come later. Perhaps at that time, no one saw a star being formed. No one thought that the man standing in the audition line would one day change the way Hollywood views a film genre. But it was precisely in those years of rejection that Wesley Snipes built something more important than any role: an ability to endure, a resilience, and a belief that his value does not depend on whether others see it or not. And even though the road ahead was still unclear, he still continued to walk, step by step, not because he was sure he would reach the destination, but because he could not accept stopping halfway. And then, after all those rejections that no one remembers, after the auditions that passed in silence, something finally began to change in the life of Wesley Snipes. Not in a noisy way, not by an immediate leap, but by the first roles strong enough to make people stop and look at him a little longer. Enough for the audience to start remembering that face, that gaze, that presence, something not easy to explain, but also impossible to ignore. And from those seemingly small opportunities, a door he had stood in front of for so long finally began to open slightly. The initial roles were not just jobs. They were opportunities for him to prove that he was not just a name on the audition list, but someone who could bring something different. And when he appeared in New Jack City, a film that not only told about crime but also reflected the dark corners of society, Wesley was not simply part of the story. He became a highlight, a presence that made the audience feel the weight in every frame, a type of energy that was both controlled and explosive. As if all those years of restraint, all those rejections, all those things left unsaid were poured into every look, every gesture. Then came White Men Can't Jump, a film with a completely different color, where he not only showed strength but also demonstrated flexibility, intelligence, and the ability to connect with the audience in a more intimate way. And it was that diversity that began to make the industry pay attention. No longer able to put him into a single mold, no longer able to overlook a talent that was gradually becoming clearer through each role, each step, each choice he made. Recognition did not come overwhelmingly, but it was enough to create a change. Invitations began to appear more. Meetings became different. People who once did not see him now began to listen. And for Wesley, that was not just a step forward in his career, but a confirmation that everything he had been through was not meaningless, that those years of rejection were not the end, but part of the journey leading to this moment. The moment when the world finally began to see him. But along with that recognition, something else also began to appear. Pressure. Not the pressure of having nothing, but the pressure of having to keep what he had just gained. The pressure of not being allowed to return to the position he had tried so hard to leave. The pressure that each next role had to be better, stronger, more memorable. And in an industry where attention can change very quickly, maintaining the position is sometimes even harder than achieving it. For a person who is used to being in control, That pressure is not just an external factor, but becomes part of the way he thinks, the way he works. Each choice begins to carry more weight. Each decision is no longer purely about art, but also about position, about image, about how not to lose what has just been built. And that, over time, begins to create a tension that not everyone can see from the outside. Even though he had begun to become famous, even though he had roles that were recognized, Wesley's inner self was still not truly stable. Because external recognition could not immediately erase the years of self-doubt, could not immediately fill the gaps that had existed for so long, and therefore, even when standing in front of the lights, even when receiving the attention he had once desired, there was still a part of him questioning, still a part that did not completely believe that he had reached where he belonged. There are moments when success begins to feel fragile, not because it is really about to disappear, but because he has never completely felt certain about it, and when you do not feel certain, you will try to control more. Try to hold tighter. Try to ensure that nothing can make everything slip out of your hands. And it is precisely that need for control, that begins to seep into the way he works, the way he interacts with others, the way he perceives the world around him. The world at this time has begun to see Wesley Snipes, but what few people realize is that he himself is still trying to see himself, still trying to understand who he is in the midst of everything that is happening. Whether he is the man who was once rejected or the star being recognized, whether he is standing on a solid foundation or just a temporary step before another change. And when those questions still have no answers, fame, even if real, cannot bring complete peace. Therefore, when looking back at this period, one can see a turning point, a moment when the world finally recognizes the value of Wesley Snipes. But beneath that, there is still an unfinished journey, a person still searching for stability within himself, and it is precisely that unfinished state that will continue to influence what happens later. Because when you step into the light without truly understanding yourself, that light can illuminate, but can also magnify the things you have not yet faced. And then, when the lights had begun to shine directly on him, when the name Wesley Snipes was no longer a coincidence in the cast list, but had become a deliberate choice, something bigger arrived. Not just another role, but an opportunity strong enough to completely change the trajectory of his life. When he stepped into the world of Blade, a character unlike anything Hollywood had ever placed at the center before, a half-human, half-vampire warrior. Cold, precise, not needing anyone's approval to exist, and in that role, Wesley did not just act, he merged with it, as if all those years of training, all those layers of discipline, all those suppressed emotions finally found a concrete form to express themselves. Blade was not an easy role, but for Wesley it carried a strange familiarity, because that character also existed between two worlds, not fully belonging to any place, always in a state of control, always keeping distance, always ready to fight. And it was that similarity that made his performance different, not a simple immersion, but a reflection, where the real person and the characters seemed to intersect, creating an image so powerful that the audience did not just watch, but believed that this was not just a role, but a part of the man himself. The success of the film did not come slowly. It exploded, spread, and almost immediately, Wesley Snipes became an icon, not only in the action film genre, but in an entirely new direction for Hollywood, where superhero stories began to be taken more seriously, where a character did not need to carry a traditional image to still stand at the center and attract millions of viewers. And in that shift, he was not just part of a trend, he was the trailblazer, the one who proved that a different image could exist, a different kind of hero, a different way of storytelling. Along with that success, power began to appear. Not just financial power or fame, but power in the way he was perceived, in the way he could influence projects, decisions, everything happening around him, and for a person who was used to control, this was both a reward and an expansion of what he had always sought, the ability to shape not only himself but also the environment around him, the ability not to wait for opportunities but to create them. In his work, that began to show more clearly. Wesley did not just participate. He wanted to control, wanted to ensure that everything happened in the way he believed was right. From the way characters were built to the way each scene was executed, each movement, and for many people, that was a sign of a dedicated person, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But at the same time, it also began to create distances, small conflicts that at first might not be clear, but over time gradually became hard to ignore. The change did not only happen in work, but in the way he saw himself and the world around him. Because when you go from someone who has to seek opportunities to someone who is sought after, the way you walk, the way you think, the way you define your own value will change. And for Wesley, that was not a gentle transition, but a big leap, where he had to adapt to a new reality, where every eye was on him, where every decision carried more consequences than before. A certain confidence began to form, a feeling that he had reached the position he had once aimed for, that the difficult years had been rewarded, and along with it, a new way of looking at the world, no longer a place where he had to struggle to be seen, but a place where he was seen and had to maintain that. And this transformation, although it brought strength, also began to carry pressures that were not always easy to recognize, because when you stand at the peak, everything around you changes. Not only the way others look at you, but also the way you look at yourself. And if the inner foundation is not truly stable, if the old questions have not yet been answered, then what the outside brings, no matter how big, cannot completely fill that gap. And in Wesley's case, the success of Blade was not just a milestone but a turning point, where everything he had built was placed in a new position, a higher, brighter position, but also more fragile in a way that not everyone could recognize. Therefore, when looking at this period, people see a peak, a moment when everything seemed perfect, a star in a position many dreamed of, but beneath that surface there were still silent movements, changes in the way he existed, in the way he controlled, in the way he faced the world. And those very changes, although they did not immediately lead to consequences, laid the foundation for what would happen later, when power, control, and ego began to interact in ways that could not always maintain balance. And when the peak had arrived, when the name Wesley Snipes no longer needed an introduction, when his image was tied to strength, precision, and power that few could touch, something else also began to form. Not noisily, not clear from the beginning, but enough to change the way he existed among those around him. Because when a person had become used to controlling everything, when success reinforced the belief that the way he did things was right, the boundary between confidence and rigidity became thinner than ever. And in the work environment, where each film is the result of coordination among many people, that began to create clashes that had not happened before. Relationships with colleagues were no longer simple as before, no longer a natural collaboration between people trying together to create a common product, but gradually carried unnamed tensions, not always spoken out loud, but could be felt through the way of communication, through the silences between conversations, through looks that were no longer completely comfortable, because when one person began to want to control more, to ensure everything happened in the way he believed was right, others, even with their own talent and experience, could feel pushed aside, no longer a real part of the creative process. Wesley's control tendency, which had been formed long before, now had a larger space to express itself. And when there were no clear boundaries, it began to spread, from adjusting the way of acting, the way characters were built, to the way scenes were executed. Every small detail became important, not because he wanted to cause difficulty, but because he believed it was the way to achieve the best result. But in an environment where each person had their own perspective, that control, even with good intentions, could become a source of pressure, something that made others feel not trusted, not listened to. Over time, distance began to appear, not like a clear separation, but like a slow shift, where Wesley gradually stood in a different position from those around him, not because he wanted to be separate, but because the way he worked, the way he thought, the way he controlled had made connection more difficult, and in spaces that previously had exchange, now there might only remain execution, where people worked next to each other, but not truly together. They were conflicts that were never brought to light, no big confrontations, but they existed in small details, in who had the final say, in whose ideas were accepted, in the way a scene was executed. And for Wesley, each decision carried meaning, each choice needed to be controlled, because, for him, it was not just work, but the way he protected what he had built. But for others, that could carry a different meaning, a feeling that not every voice had equal value, even while standing at the peak of his career, even with everything an actor could desire, from fame to influence, from recognition to opportunities. A sense of isolation still gradually appeared, not because of a lack of people around, but because of a lack of real connection. Because when you cannot share, when you do not easily open up, when you always keep a distance to protect yourself, then even when surrounded by many people, you can still feel like you are standing alone. And for Wesley, that was not a new experience. It was just another form of what he had felt long before. Success, in this case, does not bring the connection that many people expect. It does not automatically create deep relationships. It does not automatically fill the internal gaps, and when those elements do not change, achieving the peak simply changes the context, not the essence, and therefore, even though everything on the outside seems perfect, inside there still exist questions, unresolved feelings, things that no one can see just by observing from afar. One can look at this period and see a man in a position that many dream of, a person who can choose projects, who can influence outcomes, who can shape his own path, but at the same time, he is also a person who is gradually losing things that not everyone realizes are important: the connection, the trust, the ability to work with others without needing to control everything. And when those things begin to decline, what remains, even if still strong, also becomes different. And in that change, one thing becomes clearer over time: that success does not always bring what people think, that power does not always mean stability, and that a person can achieve a lot from the outside. But if what is inside has not yet been resolved, then those achievements, no matter how great, cannot completely replace what has been missing for so long. And it is precisely that deficiency, that gap, that will continue to influence what happens next, when everything begins to change in ways that no one can fully control. And then, when the distance had grown large enough that it was no longer easy to fill, when the connections gradually became fragile, and what was inside was still not truly stable, the life of Wesley Snipes began to turn in a direction that no role could have prepared him for. Not a pre-written scene, not a script that could be controlled, but a reality where everything happened beyond his reach, where decisions from the past began to come back, step by step, quietly but inevitably, until they converged into an incident that the whole world could not ignore. The tax issues did not appear in a single moment. They accumulated over time, through financial choices, through advice he trusted, through systems he believed were working properly, and for a long time, perhaps he himself did not see the full picture. Because when you are in a position where everything revolves around you, when you rely on those who are supposed to be experts, the line between control and dependence becomes blurred, and it is precisely in that gray area that the discrepancies began to form. Not noisily, not clearly, but enough to create consequences. When the investigation process began, it was not just a legal procedure, but a collision between two worlds: the world Wesley was familiar with, where he had power, influence, the ability to shape outcomes, and another world where the law does not care about fame, where everything is measured by regulations, by evidence, by what had been done. not by what he had once achieved, and in that collision, one thing became clear: that there are systems where even if you have controlled so many things, you still cannot control them. The financial decisions, even though made with the belief that they were right, began to reveal serious consequences, not only on paper but in the way they were viewed by the legal system. And when everything was brought to light, when the numbers, the records, the details were examined coldly, with no room for personal interpretation, no room for external reasons, only what had happened remained. And for Wesley, that was not just a challenge but a confrontation with a reality he could not shape as he wished. The trial was not a stage where he could perform, not a space where he could control the story. It was a place where he had to stand and listen, where decisions were made by people not influenced by his fame, where everything was weighed based on completely different standards from what he was used to. And in that moment, the man who had once stood at the highest position in an industry now stood in a system where he had no power, no protection, no ability to change the outcome as he wanted. The sentence pronounced was not just a legal outcome. It was a breaking point, a moment where everything before and after was no longer the same, where the career was interrupted, where the image was changed, where the way the public perceived him was no longer as before. And for a person who had built an entire journey based on control and discipline, facing a result he could not change was not an easy experience, not only because of the external consequences, but because of what it reflected about the choices that had been made. The collapse did not happen in a loud sound. It happened through the way the story was retold, through the way the media mentioned his name, through the way previous images were replaced by different headlines, different words, and in the eyes of the public, the person who was once seen as an icon began to be viewed from a different angle, not just as an actor, but as a person facing the legal system. A person whose story no longer revolved only around success, but also around mistakes and consequences. From the top position, where he had once been one of the faces shaping a genre, Wesley now stood in a different position. Not a place where he could choose projects, but a place where he had to face what had happened. Not a place where he was seen as a role model, but a place where he became an example of what can happen when things go off track. And in that transition, one thing became undeniable: that no success is big enough to put you outside the system, that no power is strong enough to guarantee that every decision will have no consequences. There may be factors that he did not fully control. There may be decisions made based on incomplete information. But when everything had happened, when everything had been placed before a system that does not care about personal context, the only thing left was reality, and that reality could not be changed by willpower, could not be adjusted by determination. It existed like a stopping point, a moment where everything had to be looked at again, from the beginning. And in that moment, amid everything that had been lost, amid the change in the way the world perceived him, amid the interruption of a career that had once seemed unshakable, perhaps the hardest thing was not accepting what was happening, but facing the question of where it all began. That in all those previous years, in all the decisions that had been made, where was the point where everything started to deviate from the path he once thought he was on? And when that question appeared, it was no longer just about a case, but about a journey. A journey that now, for the first time in many years, Wesley Snipes could no longer control the way it was told. And then, when all the familiar doors had closed, when the sounds of the courtroom gradually receded and were replaced by a heavier silence, Wesley Snipes stepped into a period where nothing could shield him anymore. No more lights, no more rows, no more people around ready to respond to his every move. Only a closed space remained, where time passed more slowly, where everything happened at a different rhythm, and where he was no longer a star but only a human facing himself. The years in prison did not carry the images the public had once associated with him. There were no recorded moments, no applause, no praises, only the repetition of similar days, unchanging walls, periods of time with nothing to do except think, and in that environment, the separation was not only physical, but also psychological. Because when you are separated from everything that once defined you, you are forced to face the question of who you are when those things are no longer there. With no fame to rely on, no image to protect, Wesley had to live with a version of himself that he might not have been familiar with. A version not defined by roles, not reinforced by external recognition, and in that absence, thoughts began to appear more clearly, not obscured by work, not distracted by daily responsibilities, but existing directly, forcing him to look back at what had happened, not through the lens of the media or public opinion, but through his own experience. There are moments when time seems to stretch endlessly, where a day is not measured by events but by repeating thoughts, questions that return many times without easy answers, and in those silences, choices from the past are no longer decisions that were made and left behind, but become points he must return to, examine, understand, and accept, not to change them, but to understand where they have led. Facing the consequences of oneself is not a process that happens in a single moment. It is a journey, a gradual change in perception, from seeking external reasons to recognizing one's own role in what has happened. And for a person who is used to control, accepting that there are things he cannot control and that there are decisions he must take responsibility for is a transition that is not easy or quick, but requires time, patience, and a level of honesty with himself that not everyone is willing to face. In that space, where there is no one to impress, no one to convince, Wesley began to see life in a different way, no longer as a series of goals to achieve or positions to maintain, but as a collection of experiences, choices, and the consequences that come with them. And when everything is placed in a context no longer influenced by lights or external pressure, the value of simple things becomes clearer. Time takes on a different meaning, not something to chase, but something to understand, to reflect on, to realize what may have been overlooked before. The changes in perception are not always shown on the outside, not always visible through actions, but they exist in the way he thinks, in the way he evaluates what has passed, in the way he imagines what lies ahead, and gradually an adjustment occurs. Not a complete change, but a restructuring, where what was once central may no longer hold that position, and what was once taken lightly begins to be seen with a different meaning. It can be said that during those years, Wesley was not only separated from the world, but also placed in a position where he could not avoid facing himself, not as a star, not as an image, but as a human being with everything that had happened. And in that confrontation, even though it was not easy or quick, something began to change. Not in what had passed, but in the way he carried it, in the way he understood it, and in the way he prepared to move forward when that door opened once again, not to return as before, but to continue in a different way, a way that perhaps even he had not imagined before. When the door finally opened and the outside world once again appeared before his eyes, Wesley Snipes did not step out as the man who had once left, no longer the image of a star at his peak, no longer the name that made producers wait, but as a human returning to freedom in a world that had continued moving without him. And the first thing he felt was not complete liberation, but a void, a gap between what he once was and what he was now facing, a reality with no way to turn back. Life in freedom did not immediately bring a sense of familiarity, because what he knew before had changed. The rhythm of life was different, people were different, and more importantly, his position in all of that was no longer the same. No longer natural invitations, no longer constant calls, no longer projects designed around his presence, but instead a silence, not a direct rejection, but the absence of opportunities, an emptiness he had never had to face before. Hollywood does not stop to wait for anyone, and in the years he was absent, a new generation had emerged. New faces, new styles, new trends, all filling the space he had once occupied. And when he returned, He did not step into an empty spot, but into a system that had been rearranged, where everything had found its new place, and finding his footing again was no longer a natural process but a real challenge. Opportunities did not completely disappear, but they no longer carried the same weight as before, no longer immediate central roles, no longer the certainty that his presence would be the deciding factor, but instead smaller offers, less prominent roles, projects that did not always reflect his full capabilities. And in that change, a quiet question emerged, not from the outside but from within, whether he still belonged here or whether he was just trying to reclaim something that no longer existed in the old way. The silence from the industry was not a declaration. No one stood up and said he was no longer welcome. But sometimes that very absence said more than any words, because in an environment where everything usually moves quickly, the lack of response, the lack of attention, the lack of initiative from the other side could carry a clear meaning that your position is no longer the same, that you need to start again, not from zero, but from a different point, where what you had once achieved is no longer enough to guarantee what you will have. The feeling of being left behind did not come as a single shock. It appeared little by little, in small moments, in realizing that new names were being mentioned more, in seeing big projects being made without his involvement, in understanding that the world did not stop just because he had been absent. And for a person who had once been at the center, standing on the edge was not easy to accept, not because of pride, but because of the huge change in the way you exist. But amid all of that, something else also began to form. An adjustment, not giving up but adapting. Because if there was one thing Wesley had learned from everything he had been through, it was the ability to continue, not under ideal conditions, but in reality. And reality at this time no longer looked like before, no longer favorable conditions, no longer clear opportunities. But there were still possibilities, still paths, even if smaller, narrower, with less light. The effort to adapt was not an easy process. It required accepting what had changed, letting go of part of the old image, reevaluating one's value in a new context. And for Wesley, that was not only about work, but also about the way he saw himself. No longer just a star who had once been at the peak, but a person continuing his journey in a different phase, with different conditions, with different expectations. There may no longer be the brilliant moments like before, no longer roles that immediately shape an entire genre, but there are still steps, there are still choices, and in each small step, something is preserved, not the old position, but the ability to continue existing, the ability not to disappear completely, the ability to stand firm in a world that has changed without completely losing oneself. And it is precisely in this period, even though it is not loud, even though it is not noticed as before, a different kind of strength begins to appear. Not the strength of power or fame, but the strength of continuing when things are no longer the same, of walking when the path is no longer clear, and of accepting that sometimes the journey is not about returning to where you once stood, but finding a different way to keep moving forward. And then, in a world that has changed, amid gaps that are no longer easy to fill, Wesley Snipes did not choose to disappear completely. He did not retreat into silence as many had once thought, but quietly stepped back in, not with a loud comeback, not with a project promoted as a resurrection, but with small, slow steps, almost unnoticed, but enough to show that he was still there, still continuing to work, still holding on to the connection with the profession he had devoted his entire life to pursuing. His appearance in The Expendables 3 was not a central role like before, not the image of someone leading the entire story, but a part of an ensemble, a position that previously he might not have had to accept. But this time he stepped in with a different attitude, not to affirm who he was, but to show that he could still contribute, could still be present, could still bring value in a different way, a way that no longer placed heavy emphasis on having to stand at the center. Then came Dolomite Is My Name, a project with a different tone, where he did not need to show physical strength like before, but instead demonstrated subtlety, maturity, and a deeper approach to the character. And in moments like that, people began to see a different version of Wesley. No longer just the man of action, but an actor who had been through many upheavals, carrying layers of experience that could not be faked, things that only time and what had happened could create. No longer having the old status does not mean having no value, but accepting that was not easy, especially for someone who had once stood at the peak, and therefore every step in this period carried an adjustment, a balance between keeping what had made him who he was and adapting to the new reality, where he was no longer the center of every project, where he had to share the space with other generations, with different stories, with different approaches. Wesley's persistence in this period did not lie in big achievements, but in the very fact that he continued to appear, continued to take roles, continued to work in an environment that no longer reserved familiar positions for him, and that required a different kind of strength, not the strength to conquer, but the strength to maintain, to not disappear, to not let what had happened define the rest of his life. There were times when that presence might not be noticed, not mentioned like before, not creating big waves, but it existed, steady and resilient, and it was precisely in that steadiness that something was rebuilt, not the old image, but a new version, a person no longer completely bound by previous expectations, no longer having to prove himself in the way he once thought necessary, but simply working, continuing, keeping the flame of the profession from going out. Focusing on the craft rather than fame is a shift not everyone can make, because when you have experienced attention, when you have lived in the spotlight, accepting a less prominent position requires a change in how you perceive value, no longer measuring yourself by the number of big roles or the level of fame, but by whether you can still continue doing what you believe is right, whether you can still maintain the connection with the work you chose. And in the later roles, even if they were not always perfect, even if they were not always widely mentioned, one thing could still be seen clearly, that Wesley Snipes was no longer trying to become the person he once was, but was learning how to exist as the person he had become. A person who had gone through peaks and falls. A person who understood that the road ahead no longer looked like before, but could still continue walking in his own way. For many people, this return might not be what they expected. Not a story told with new peaks, but precisely because of that, it carried a different meaning, not about regaining everything, but about not losing everything completely. Not about returning to the old position, but about creating a new position, even if smaller, even if with less light, but more real, closer to his true self. And in that quietness, there was a different kind of victory. Not loud, not needing wide recognition, but enough to prove that he was still here, still continuing, and his journey had not ended. And when the steps had slowed down, when the roles were no longer the center of every story, Wesley Snipes gradually shifted into a space that few had seen before. A space without lights, without cameras, without newspaper headlines, where he no longer needed to prove anything to the world, but only needed to exist as an ordinary human being, with roles he had once had, but had never placed before the spotlight, the role of a husband, a father, a person living in relationships not defined by fame. His family life was not displayed, not told through interviews or staged images. It existed in privacy, in moments the public did not see. Meals without cameras, conversations that did not need to be recorded, and that very privacy became a conscious choice, a way to keep a part of life untouched by what had happened outside, a way to build a space he could control in a different way, not through power, but through stillness. In the role of a husband, he was no longer the image of a star, but a person who had to learn how to listen, how to share, how to exist in a relationship where control was no longer the only factor, where presence was not measured by success but by care, by time, by the small things he might not have considered important before. And in that process, perhaps he was also relearning things he had missed early on, things related to connection, to letting others in, without having to build overly thick layers of protection. The role of a father carried a different, deeper meaning, because it was not only about the present, but also about shaping the future of others. And for Wesley, that might have brought a clearer awareness of what he had been through, of the gaps he had once felt, and of how not to repeat those things. Not through grand words, but through presence, through creating an environment where silence was no longer distance but peace, where emotions could be shared without being suppressed. Personal values began to change, not completely, but enough to create a difference in the way he prioritized life. Fame was no longer the center, no longer the only measure, but became part of the past, part of the journey, while other things, things that received less attention, gradually took on more important positions. Stability, peace, the ability to live without constantly having to prove who he was, the ability to accept that not everything needs to reach the peak to have value. After the upheavals that had occurred, the way he viewed life could not remain the same as before, because what he had been through did not allow that. The losses, the changes, the moments when he had to face things he could not control, all left their mark. And in those marks, there was an adjustment, not completely abandoning what he once was, but learning how to exist with a different version of himself, a version no longer completely bound by what was outside, but able to find value in simpler things. Searching for stability is not a journey with a clear ending. It is a continuous process, a choice made every day, in the way he lives, in the way he prioritizes time, in the way he interacts with those around him, and in accepting that there are things that cannot return but can still be replaced by other things not the same but enough to create a meaningful life in his own way. From the outside, this life may no longer carry the appeal of the years before, no longer those brilliant moments, no longer roles that define an entire period. But inside, it carries a different value, a peace that is not always achievable when you are at the peak, a stability that does not come from controlling everything but from accepting what cannot be controlled. And in that acceptance, there is a different kind of freedom, not loud, not showy, but deeper, and perhaps it is precisely in this space that the world does not see, where there is no pressure to become someone, where there is no expectation to maintain an image, that Wesley Snipes has found a part of himself that he had not truly touched before, a part not defined by roles or fame, but by the way he lives, the way he loves, and the way he continues to walk, not to return to where he once stood, but to exist in a way he can accept, a way he can call his own. And when all the noise has receded into the background, when the lights no longer shine directly on his life as before, the story of Wesley Snipes is no longer the story of a star, but the story of a human being looking back at himself, not to repaint the past, not to justify what happened, but to understand, to accept, and to continue walking with everything he carries, both success and mistakes, both the brilliant moments and the periods when he had to face things no one wants. One can look back at that journey as a straight line with clear high and low points, from the years of rejection to the roles that took him to the peak, then to the collapse that the whole world witnessed. But for Wesley himself, it was not separate parts but a continuous flow, where every decision, every choice, every reaction contributed to the final outcome, and in that connection, one thing becomes hard to avoid: that what happened was not only circumstance but also the consequence of what he had chosen, had believed, had done. Admitting that is not an easy act, not something everyone is willing to do, especially when the consequences have been too clear, too heavy. But in the process of reflection, In the years when he had time to look back without being swept up in the pace of the world, a change took place, not denying what happened, but accepting that they are part of the story, that there is no way to separate them from who he is, and that continuing cannot be based on pretending they never existed. Not denying personal responsibility does not mean defining oneself by the mistakes, but placing them in their proper place, as things that happened, as unavoidable lessons, as milestones without which the man he is today would not be the same, and in that perspective there is a new balance, where he is no longer trapped in having to protect the old image, nor completely overwhelmed by what was lost, but can exist in the middle, with a clearer understanding of himself. Continuing to live and work in a period when he is no longer at the peak is not a compromise but a choice, a decision that the value of a person is not only measured by the highest position they once reached, but by how they continue when they are no longer in that position. And for Wesley, that is not shown through grand statements, but through the very quiet steps, through continuing to take roles, continuing to work, continuing to keep a connection with the profession he chose, even without the glamour as before. A different image gradually emerges, not Blade, not the action icon the audience once knew, but a man who has been through a lot, who has stood at the highest places, and has also gone through periods where everything seemed to collapse. A person who is not perfect, not free from mistakes, but who also does not disappear when facing consequences. A person who continues to exist, not by returning to the past, but by accepting the present and moving forward from there. For some people, this story does not deliver the ending they expected. No glorious return, no new peak replacing the old one. But perhaps that is exactly what makes it more real, closer to actual life, where not every journey ends with a brilliant victory, but often the most important thing is simply not stopping, not letting what happened become the ending point. And if there is one thing people can realize when looking at the entire journey of Wesley Snipes, it is not how great he once was, but how he continued when things were no longer the same. The way he carried what happened, without letting it completely define who he is. The way he existed in a world that had changed without completely losing himself. And the way he continued, not as an untouchable legend, but as a human being, with everything that human has, both strength and weakness, both right and wrong. And perhaps, what all of us have always felt, even if not spoken, is not the question of what he has lost or what he can regain, but a simpler truth. That behind all the images, the titles, the upheavals, Wesley Snipes has never been just a legend. He has always been a human being, a human who is built, has lost, has learned, and is still continuing to walk, step by step, in a journey that is not always clear, but has never truly ended. The story of Wesley Snipes leaves a heavy feeling, not because he failed, but because of the way he had to learn to keep living after losing almost everything that once defined him. From an action icon in Blade, who once stood at the center of Hollywood with nearly absolute power and control, to the image of a man standing before the court, then stepping into prison in silence. That was not only the collapse of a career, but the breaking of a belief system he had built since childhood in the Bronx, where he learned not to trust anyone and had to control everything himself. That very thing, which was once his strength, became a double-edged sword, causing him to gradually isolate himself in relationships, creating tensions on set, and leading to wrong choices in his personal life. What makes people feel sorry is not that he stumbled, but that he had to face all those consequences alone, in the years separated from the world, when there were no more lights, no more fame, only silence and questions that could not be avoided. But what is worthy of respect is that he did not disappear. He accepted starting again from smaller roles like in The Expendables 3 or Dolomite Is My Name, no longer seeking glamour but focusing on continuing the profession, continuing to exist. For American society, This story reminds us that success does not exempt anyone from the consequences of personal choices, and in a culture that values the individual, what matters is not that you have never been wrong, but whether you have enough responsibility to face it and enough resilience to continue afterward. If this story makes you think about what a person can lose and still continue, please hit subscribe and join us in the upcoming journeys. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where real stories continue to be told, even if they do not always have a perfect ending.